It's been 30 years and the Gulf War is still the hugest armed conflict since World War II. It involved 35 countries, more than 1 million militaries, and showed the world what a well-planned air raid can do. Want to know more? Buckle up and get comfortable, because our story starts almost 40 years ago. In the late 1980s, after 8 years of a brutal and bloody war with Iran that did not result in any significant gains, Iraq became a heavily indebted nation. The war was financed thanks to loans made by other Arab countries, mainly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which saw Iran and its extremist Islamic regime as a possible source of destabilization for the region. In 1988, the war ended, and neither country could be called the victor. Iraq's creditors began to collect the loans, but Saddam Hussein had a country under reconstruction, and the oil price was getting lower and lower, and there was no way he could afford those debts. In 1989, Saddam began to pressure the Saudis and Kuwaitis for debt forgiveness, but failed. In the meantime, Kuwait, which also needed financial resources, began to increase its oil production and greatly exceeded its quota. As a result, the barrel price dropped from $18 to $10 in a few months, between 1989 and 1990. This further worsened the situation in Iraq, which had the sale of oil as its main source of income. In June 1990, Saddam neither had the resources to pay off his debts nor to rebuild his devastated country. He needed an alternative solution and accused Kuwait of violating the production quotas stipulated by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Saddam even threatened that country with a direct military attack if the oil production wasn't slowed down. On July 15th, in a speech to the Arab League, he accused Kuwait of using the Al Rumaila oil fields on the Iraqi border and also accused Saudi Arabia of collecting a debt he considered illegal. Saddam argued that he should not have to bear all the costs of the war as Iran was an enemy of both countries. At the end of that same month, U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie denounced the movement of 30,000 Iraqi troops towards the border with Kuwait. At a meeting, Glaspie told Saddam she understood Iraq's financial needs, but the United States would not tolerate an attack on Kuwait. That warning certainly made Saddam rethink the invasion, but it all went down the drain during the diplomatic discussion that took place a week later, on July 31st. During a conversation involving the leaders of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Kuwait, Saddam demanded $10 billion as a form of reparation for the damage caused by the increase in Kuwaiti oil production. The counterproposal was $9 billion, but Saddam saw it as a sign of weakness, and 2 days later ordered his forces to advance. Despite being greatly weakened after the war with Iran, Iraq still had a very strong army consisting of almost 1 million soldiers, 650,000 paramilitaries, 4,500 armored vehicles, 480 planes, and 230 helicopters. Kuwait, on the other hand, had only 16,000 soldiers, distributed among 3 armored regiments, a mechanized infantry regiment, and an artillery brigade. The result was obvious, a crushing Iraqi victory after just 12 hours of fighting, and the last pockets of resistance were eliminated 2 days later. After a quick victory over Kuwait, those forces immediately moved to the Saudi Arabian border. The international response was quick, demanding the immediate withdrawal of the invading troops. Several resolutions were voted by UN in order to force Saddam to withdraw, but he ignored them all. On August 6th, just 4 days after the invasion, Resolution 661 was passed, imposing economic sanctions against Iraq, followed by Resolution 665, which authorized a broad naval blockade. Saddam's troops were firmly entrenched near the Saudi border, and after those sanctions, he proposed a series of possible solutions to the conflict. But all involved other Arab matters such as the Israeli occupation of territories in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Saddam's goal was to transform the Kuwait invasion into an issue that involved the entire Arab world, linking its invasion to complex problems that had absolutely nothing to do with the matter. Saddam planned to delay the discussions enough to have time to assimilate Kuwait's oil wells and prepare his defenses against a possible foreign attack. But President George H.W. Bush quickly thwarted Saddam's plan and managed to stop him from tying the invasion of Kuwait to other sensitive issues in the Middle East. Well, now we will talk about the Desert Shield operation, but before we start, hit the like button to increase this video's relevance and help it reach more people. Thank you. The first American troops arrived at the border in August of that year. The objective of the Desert Shield operation was to stop the advance of Iraqi troops toward the Saudi border and prevent them from reaching the oil fields, acting as a real shield. Saddam had about 120,000 soldiers stationed there and threatened to take the rich oil sources in that country if Saddam conquered at least the Saudis' wells closest to the border. Thanks to the Kuwaiti ones already under his domain, it would give him control of almost 60% of world's oil production, an unacceptable situation for both Arabs and Westerners. The remaining months of 1990 would be filled with negotiations between the United States and its allies across the world. The goal was to create a grand military coalition to expel Saddam Hussein. Much of the money needed to cover the expenses of this coalition came from the Saudis and the Kuwaitis themselves, who together contributed nearly $30 billion. Other countries such as Germany and Japan contributed more than $10 billion. Many other nations sent soldiers, equipment, and supplies. In total, the United States managed to create a coalition of 34 countries while securing full funding for the war through partners in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. More than 950,000 soldiers were grouped in bases in Saudi Arabia under the command of General Norman Schwarzkopf. 73% of them were North Americans. In December 1990, the coalition was finally ready. But Saddam knew the attack was imminent, so he surrounded himself with Western civilians captured in Iraq and Kuwait during the August invasion, creating a broad human shield. On January 15, 1991, the deadline given by the UN for the withdrawal of Iraqi troops from Kuwait expired, and on the same day, President George Bush authorized the offensive to start. It began the following day, with an extensive aerial bombing over military bases and command centers in Iraq and Kuwait, and marked the beginning of the next phase of the war, known today as Desert Storm Operation. During 42 days, an absurd 100,000 air attack missions were carried out, resulting in the dropping of more than 88,000 tons of bombs. This was and still is the most intense and concentrated aerial bombardment of all military history. This airstrike was split into 3 phases. The first dedicated to the destruction of the Iraqi Air Force and its anti-air defenses. The objective of the second was to attack and destroy the command and communication centers. The third and final phase, the biggest of all, aimed to attack and destroy military ground targets such as missile launchers, tanks, and remaining military bases. Most of these airstrikes departed from bases in Saudi Arabia, but also from 6 North American aircraft carriers operating off the Persian Gulf. At this early stage, Iraq responded by launching Scud missiles at targets in Saudi Arabia and particularly against Israel, which curiously had no active connection with the coalition. Saddam's goal was to bring the Israelis to war, something that wouldn't be tolerated by the state's Arab allies. If Israel attacked any Arab country, even if it was Iraq, it could cause a division within the coalition and weaken it. But despite the attacks, Israel did not counterattack and remained just defending itself, thanks to anti-air defenses provided by the Americans, mostly Patriot missile batteries. On January 29, during coalition airstrikes, Saddam attacked Saudi Arabia by land and conquered the city of Khafji near the border. This invasion force was immediately counterattacked by U.S., Saudi, and Qatari soldiers who, thanks to the impressive aerial firepower, were able to free the city the next day. The air offensive ended on February 24th, and the ground offensive began. The first forces to enter were 2 divisions of Marines and a light motorized infantry battalion. This force was followed by many other units and rapidly advanced towards the capital, encountering just a weak resistance. Iraqis were usually limited to firing a few shots, surrendering after a few minutes of combat. The next day, the Iraqis counterattacked from positions close to their border, but despite heavy fighting, they were forced to retreat after a few hours. When they arrived in Kuwait City, the capital of that country, the American Marines kept their distance, and as a symbol of respect and cooperation, the coalition let the Kuwaiti forces have the honor of fetching the capital of their country. On February 27th, 4 days after the start of the ground offensive, Saddam ordered all Iraqi troops to leave Kuwait, but this order surely didn't reach most troops, because their armored division kept fighting till the death. The Iraqis suffered heavy casualties in these land skirmishes. After all, the Soviet T-72 tanks were no match for the American Abrams tanks and the British Challenger 1. Chaos engulfed the invaders as they tried to flee. Some 2,500 vehicles were corralled on Highway 80, linking Kuwait and Iraq. Most were troop transport trucks and armored vehicles. Needless to say, those were seating ducks for the American Air Force, who crushed that highway, mostly with the A-10 Thunderbolt ground attack aircraft. The death toll in this attack is extremely controversial and fluctuates widely. Some sources put 200 to 300 casualties, while others claim that over 1,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed and another 10,000 wounded, many of them dying days later. This incident gave Highway 80 the nickname Highway of Death. Parallel to attacks inside Kuwait, coalition forces also attacked further north, entered Iraq and headed for the Iranian border. The purpose of this movement was to prevent the retreating forces from escaping into Iraq and organizing a counterattack. Thanks to this strategy, most of Saddam's forces were trapped between Kuwait and Iraq, and thousands of these soldiers were captured as they fled. During the escape, Iraqi troops were ordered by Saddam to set fire to all 737 oil wells in Kuwait, causing tremendous economic damage and an ecological disaster of enormous proportions. On February 28, 100 hours after the start of the ground offensive, President Bush ordered a ceasefire and an end to hostilities. This decision was widely criticized. After all, most of the Iraqi troops had already left Kuwait and the coalition forces were only 240 kilometers from the capital Baghdad and could easily put an end to Saddam's regime. The Bush administration defends itself by arguing that this was not the objective of the coalition and that its mission was only to liberate Kuwait. And on March 10, 2 weeks after the victory, 540,000 American troops began to return home. Many controversies have arisen with this war, many of them linked to the health of Allied soldiers. There were many cases of fetal malformation among the children of veterans who have fought that war, as well as cases of cancer, possibly caused by the depleted uranium used in the munitions. Despite emitting 40% less radiation than the uranium found in nature, it can still cause damage to the body in case of excessive exposure. The Death Highway episode is also controversial. Some argue that Iraqi soldiers were attacked as they retreated from the combat zone, and Allied forces defended themselves by saying those were soldiers on the battlefield. Other sources also claim that during the aerial bombing phase, many civilian infrastructures were attacked, causing much greater damage to the civilian population than to the military. International entities also condemned the Americans for having abandoned the Kurds, who rebelled against Saddam's government at the very beginning of operations. The exit of the Iraqi coalition left the Kurds to fend for themselves, millions fled to Turkey or Iran, and the rest ended up suffering persecution and were massacred by Saddam during the following years as a sign of revenge. This was the first war that had full-scale media coverage, thanks to the involvement of major news networks such as CNN, which kept cameras following the military in the field and the attack operations in both Kuwait and Iraq. This war also marked the debut of so-called smart bombs, guided by laser or GPS. Those are much more accurate and drastically reduce the number of artifacts needed to destroy a target. According to estimates, the number of fatalities among Iraqi soldiers ranges from 20 to 26,000 and about 75,000 wounded. On the coalition side, the death toll ranges between 350 and 700 and the wounded between 800 and 1,000. It is very difficult to say the number of casualties among civilians, but 2,300 Iraqi deaths and about 1,000 casualties among Kuwaiti, Israeli, and Saudi are estimated. Kuwait oil wells that were set on fire only returned to normality at the end of 1991, at the cost of more than $2 billion. And about those Western captives, they were all returned safe and sound to their countries, but not without a tremendous diplomatic effort, particularly from Deputy Chief of Mission Joseph Wilson, who was in charge of negotiations since the ambassador April Glaspie was out of the country on medical leave. It's well known that in a war, truth dies first. And this one was certainly no different, but I assure you I tried my best to bring you guys the most reliable info I found. Like most wars, this one also left many questions unanswered. It purely was an aggression provoked by greed, which resulted in the destruction and death of tens of thousands of lives. It's 2022 and we are still watching this same crap happening in Ukraine. That's the nature of war. And war never changes. Thanks for watching until now. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching.